They went in quietly, federal agents walking through the halls of the Park Hyatt in Manhattan. Diddy was inside, supposedly preparing to turn himself in. It was all meant to be routine, calm, controlled. But when they opened the closet in his hotel suite, they found something unexpected. Several oversized bags of baby oil, bottles of Astroglide, and tucked in the bathroom, a prescription bottle filled with pink powder, a mix later confirmed to contain MDMA, cocaine, and possibly GHB. The prescription was written for someone named Frank Black. Frank Black doesn't exist. That alias had been used before by Diddy himself, according to prosecutors, to book hotel rooms specifically for what insiders call freakoffs. But that moment, as strange as it sounds, was just the surface of what's turning into one of the most disturbing and complex celebrity trials in recent memory. Because what's unfolding in that New York courtroom isn't just about fame or power. It's about control, fear, coercion, and a relationship that spanned over a decade, one that Cassie says turned her into someone she barely recognized. And even now, as she takes a stand and shares her story, people aren't just debating what happened behind closed doors. They're asking what it means when someone says yes out of fear. When intimacy becomes currency. When silence costs $5 million. So, what really happened between Diddy and Cassie? And more importantly, will the jury believe her? Cassie sat in the witness box for the last time on Friday, May 16th, 2025, after days of grueling cross-examinations, redirect questioning, and even a brief recross. It was clear this wasn't just about what she said. It was how the jury felt about her by the end of it. The courtroom was tense. Reporters scribbled notes. Every word, every pause, every look. It was being watched, dissected, and spun across the internet in real time. The defense, led by attorney Ana Estabio, had a clear goal. They wanted to convince the jury that Cassie wasn't a victim, not of trafficking, not of coercion, and not of abuse in the way the prosecution had framed it. Instead, they painted her as a willing participant, someone who had chosen the lifestyle and stayed in it willingly for over a decade. They focused heavily on text messages between her and Diddy. Some were affectionate, others were sexual. A few were graphic. One simply said, "I love our freak-offs when we both want it." That line became central to the defense's strategy. To them, it implied consent, maybe even desire. But there was something about the way the defense delivered these texts that felt forced, as if they were trying to squeeze meaning from fragments. These weren't love letters, they weren't deep confessions. They were short, sometimes cryptic exchanges, the kind you send when emotions are raw and layered, the kind you send when you're still figuring out what's real and what you're afraid to admit. Cassie acknowledged the messages. She didn't deny them, but she added context the defense didn't offer. That often, those messages weren't about what she wanted. They were about avoiding Diddy's anger, about staying safe, about keeping things smooth, because, as she explained to the jury, when Diddy got angry, it didn't end with words. By 2018, the relationship between Cassie and Diddy was officially over, at least on paper. But one night, in Malibu, they met for what she described as a closure dinner, a final moment to say goodbye, settle the past, and move on. It didn't go that way. Earlier that same day, Diddy had been spotted at Burning Man, a massive desert music festival, with another woman named Gina Huyn. According to Cassie, she and Gina had a long history of tension. Diddy had allegedly played them against each other for years, sometimes in private, sometimes publicly. That dinner in Malibu on the surface was calm, civil even. They ate, talked, said goodbye. Diddy drove her home, and that's where the story splits into two drastically different narratives. Cassie says that after dropping her off, Diddy broke into her home. She claims he threw her to the floor, assaulted her, and raped her. She describes his eyes as going black and says she was terrified, not just by what he did, but by how cold and disconnected he seemed while doing it. The next day, she texted him. The defense jumped on that. They showed the jury those messages, short, neutral, even friendly. Later, they claimed the two had consensual sex shortly after the alleged assault. To them, it was proof that the encounter wasn't as traumatic as she claimed. But Cassie had an explanation. She said she was trying to stay safe, trying to de-escalate. She knew Diddy's patterns. She knew what happened when she pulled away too quickly. And more than anything, she said she didn't want to trigger another outburst. That was the pattern she had lived with for years. To complicate things further, during that same time, Cassie's phone lit up with a FaceTime call. It was from Alex Fine, her personal trainer, the man who would later become her husband and the father of her children. Cassie says the call came while she was still with Diddy, either right before or right after their encounter. When asked on the stand whether Alex knew what had happened, she said, "Not at the time, but I told him everything later." The defense used this moment to imply confusion, contradiction, even deception. But prosecutors pointed out something else. That trauma rarely fits into clean, linear timelines. That victims of abuse don't always behave in ways that make sense to outsiders, especially when the person hurting them also happens to be the person they once loved. And in this case, that contradiction, love and fear living side by side, would become a theme that came up again. And again, by now the word freak-off has been mentioned in nearly every headline about this case. But in court, it took on a much darker meaning. Cassie described them in detail, not to shock, but to explain. According to her, these weren't just wild parties or experimental nights. They were planned events, orchestrated, controlled. Diddy would book hotel suites under aliases, names like Frank Black, and set everything up in advance. Escorts would be flown in, drugs would be arranged, lighting, music, even certain objects were prepared in a very specific way. Cassie said she never fully knew what was going to happen once she stepped into those rooms, but she knew what was expected. She said the sessions would last anywhere from 24 hours to 4 days. Sometimes she was instructed to recruit other women. Sometimes Diddy would bring people in himself. She spoke about escorts, male and female, hired through agencies or found directly. Some sessions involved several people. Some got violent. Most included drugs. She said she didn't feel like a girlfriend anymore. She felt like an object. And when she wasn't participating in freak-offs, she was recovering from them. Physically, mentally. She talked about infections, emotional crashes, days spent curled up, trying to numb herself. At one point, she described feeling like her entire role in Diddy's world was reduced to these events. "I wasn't an artist," she said. "I wasn't a girlfriend. I was just there for that." However, time, the line between consent and coercion got blurrier. Cassie said she would often go along with things just to avoid Diddy's anger. That yes became automatic, not because she wanted to, but because she didn't want to find out what no would trigger. According to prosecutors, this is where the legal case becomes clear. Because under US federal law, if someone is manipulated into sex acts through fear, force, coercion, or the abuse of power, especially when drugs and money are involved, that meets the threshold for trafficking. Cassie also testified that she never saw herself as trafficked while it was happening. That realization came later through therapy, through reflection, through hearing other survivors talk about their stories and realizing how much hers overlapped. The defense countered by showing texts where she appeared enthusiastic, even playful, about planning these freak-offs. But prosecutors argued that's exactly how manipulation works. You create an environment where the victim feels responsible for their own exploitation, and Diddy, according to Cassie, had mastered that environment. In 2008, a man named Jonathan O.D. was arrested for firing shots at Trump Tower. It was the kind of bizarre incident that makes the news for a day and then disappears. Until now. Because during that arrest, Jonathan made a confession. Not about the shooting, but about Diddy. According to police reports, he told investigators that he had been involved in Diddy's so-called freak-offs, that he had worked as a male escort, that he had seen things, recorded things, and that Diddy had paid him $5 million to keep quiet. On the surface, it sounds wild, but in court, the prosecution connected the dots, and they lined up. Cassie testified that during one of the freak-offs, she saw Jonathan O.D. pull out his phone and start recording. She told Diddy immediately, and not long after, Diddy allegedly paid Jonathan that massive sum via a non-disclosure agreement to suppress the footage. Where it gets murkier is motive. The defense argued that this proves Diddy was protecting Cassie. That he didn't want the footage to be leaked because it would humiliate her. That it wasn't blackmail, it was damage control. But Cassie's version was different. She said Diddy wasn't protecting her. He was protecting himself, his reputation, his empire, his control. She claimed he wanted full ownership of anything that could potentially expose him. Not because he cared about her safety, but because he didn't want anyone else to have leverage over him. She testified that he liked to keep the tapes, even cataloged them, and that he would threaten to use them if she ever tried to leave for good. He wanted to control the story, she said, and he wanted to control me. One detail that supported her claim: after Jonathan allegedly received the $5 million, his wife told investigators he suddenly bought 4 luxury properties in cash. Not leased, bought, all at once. Jonathan O.D. didn't have a job that explained that kind of money, and in court, prosecutors made the case that this payment wasn't generosity. It was evidence, a cover-up wrapped in legal paperwork, a $5 million hush check. But again, the defense pushed back. If Diddy was trying to blackmail Cassie, they asked the jury, why would he spend millions to keep the tape hidden? Why wouldn't he just use it as leverage? The jury didn't answer, but they didn't need to, not yet. Because this wasn't the end of the story. It was just another layer. If there's one word that sits at the heart of this entire case, it's consent. Not just whether Cassie said yes, but why she said yes, and what that yes actually meant. The defense leaned hard on Cassie's own words. They presented a 2013 text where she wrote, "Wish we could have freaked off before you left." Another message from 2007 read, "I love our freak-offs when we both wanted." To the defense, this was gold. Clear evidence that Cassie was engaged, willing, and even enjoying what the prosecution described as exploitation. But that second text, the one they hoped would prove consent, may have backfired. When we both wanted. It sounds like mutual affection, but to Cassie it was a subtle cry for help. On the stand, she explained what that phrase really meant. That in her world, consent wasn't always about desire. It was about safety, about survival, about avoiding the fallout that came from saying no. She said she often sent those texts to keep things calm, to turn Diddy on because that's what he expected, because he told her that her job, her role, was to keep him excited all day, every day. In those moments, she wasn't giving consent. She was giving compliance. It's a difference the prosecution made clear. Consent means freedom of choice, but when fear is part of the equation, when someone's entire livelihood, safety, and autonomy depend on doing what they're told, the line between yes and I don't have a choice gets blurry, and Cassie says that for years, that line didn't even exist. She testified that she was afraid of what might happen if she resisted, that Diddy's temper wasn't just a rumor, it was real, violent, sometimes calculated, sometimes unpredictable. The prosecution plans to bring in trauma experts to explain this further, to show how victims can appear complicit. How people stay in harmful relationships, not because they want to, but because they're psychologically trapped. And it all ties back to those texts. To the defense, their proof of consent. To the prosecution, their evidence of control. A paper trail of a woman trying to navigate fear with politeness. Because when you're surviving, a smile can be a shield, and a yes can be a way out of something worse. Somewhere along the trial, the courtroom shifted. Suddenly, the focus wasn't just on freak-offs, abuse, or manipulation. It turned to infidelity. The defense brought up name after name. A kid? Cute us, Michael B. Jordan, an unnamed NFL player, even whispers about Chris Brown. Their strategy was clear. Paint Cassie as unfaithful, inconsistent, and emotionally messy. Someone whose jealousy and double standards somehow weakened her credibility. Cassie didn't deny the relationships. She admitted that while she and Diddy were on breaks, she saw other people, briefly. Never anything long-term. Never in secret. Just attempts, she said, to reclaim some version of a life outside Diddy's control. But the bigger point, one that prosecutors emphasized, wasn't that Cassie saw other people. It was how Diddy responded when she did. Because Diddy, according to Cassie, didn't mind if she was with male escorts during freak-offs. That didn't threaten him. But when she was linked to other celebrities, people with status, visibility, and independence, he reportedly lost control. She described him raging at the idea of her being seen with someone famous. That it wasn't about love, but about image. He could parade other women in front of her. Gina Huang, strangers at parties, escorts. But if Cassie had dinner with someone like Kid Cutie, Diddy allegedly saw it as betrayal. There was a double standard, one built on ego, not emotion. Cassie also shared that Diddy often accused her of cheating, even when she wasn't. He'd see her dancing with someone in a club and immediately jump to conclusions. That's how Chris Brown's name came up. Cassie said she never had a romantic connection with him, but Diddy had convinced himself otherwise. The defense tried to use this to suggest Cassie was manipulative, that she wanted her freedom while expecting loyalty from Diddy, that she was emotionally involved with multiple people and couldn't keep her story straight. But prosecutors saw it differently. They argued that Cassie's experiences with other men weren't about cheating. They were attempts to escape, to find connection outside of the power structure she lived under, to test what life could feel like when someone wasn't controlling every move she made. In the end, it wasn't about infidelity. It was about imbalance, because the power wasn't equal. And in Cassie's world, it never had been. It's the one image most people associate with this entire case. Cassie running down a hotel hallway, Diddy chasing her, tackling her, striking her, dragging her back. The security footage recorded in a Los Angeles Intercontinental Hotel in 2016 went viral the moment it leaked. Grainy, brutal, undeniable. For many, it was the first time they saw physical proof of something that had until then lived in allegations and whispers. The defense didn't deny the video. They couldn't. Instead, they leaned on what happened after, because just days later, Cassie appeared on the red carpet with Diddy at a movie premiere, smiling, standing beside him, publicly presenting the image of a couple still intact. To the defense, that moment was critical. They pointed to it and asked, if this was as traumatic as she says, if she was afraid for her life, why would she go out in public with him? Why would she smile for cameras? But Cassie had an answer. She explained that the attack in the hotel happened during a multi-day freak-off, that the premiere was her one chance to step outside that world, to be seen as something other than what she had become. She had looked forward to that appearance for weeks, not because it was glamorous, but because it reminded her that she was more than someone's possession. She said she had to leave the hotel early mid-session to get ready for the premiere. And that's when Diddy exploded. He didn't want her leaving. Not then. Not on her own terms. Not with that kind of independence. After the attack, Cassie still showed up on the red carpet because the freak-off hadn't ended, because the relationship hadn't ended, because trauma doesn't move on schedule, and more importantly, because image mattered. Cassie said there was pressure from Diddy, from his team, from the machine around him to keep things looking perfect, even when they weren't, especially when they weren't. To her, that moment on the red carpet wasn't a contradiction. It was survival. And that's what prosecutors wanted the jury to understand. That abuse doesn't always show up in the way people expect. That victims can smile, they can pose, they can look fine, even when they're not. Because when your world is built around someone else's control, appearances are just another part of the performance. When Cassie spoke about rehab, it wasn't in the dramatic fall from grace way people might expect from a celebrity case. It was quieter than that, and heavier. She explained to the court that after years of emotional chaos, physical trauma, and substance use, she finally reached a breaking point. That's when she entered treatment, not just for drug use, but for something deeper. PTSD, the kind that lingers long after the physical wounds fade. Her therapy involved a process called EMDR, eye movement desensitization and reprocessing. It's a method designed to reframe how the brain stores traumatic memories. Cassie described it like this: it turns the memory from something you're living through into something you're just observing, like driving past a car accident instead of being in it. That's how deep the damage went. Her brain didn't just remember, it relived. But the defense took her recovery and twisted it into something else. They suggested she didn't go to rehab for trauma at all. Instead, they implied she was treated for something called love and sex addiction, as if her entire experience could be chalked up to obsession, or impulsiveness, or poor choices in men. Cassie rejected that completely. She said her time in treatment was about rebuilding herself after years of being systematically broken down. That she wasn't addicted to Diddy. She was trying to survive him, and when asked directly whether her stay was for sex addiction, she said flatly, no. The courtroom was quiet, but prosecutors knew this line of attack was coming. They anticipated it, because painting Cassie as unstable, overly sexual, or emotionally volatile is a common tactic in cases like this. It shifts the blame. It reframes the power dynamic. It suggests that the victim was the architect of her own downfall. Cassie's response was calm but pointed. She wasn't running from who she had been. She was confronting it, piece by piece, with help, with time, and that's what made the rehab discussion so revealing. It wasn't just about recovery, it was about reclaiming the story, about saying, this is what happened to me, and this is what I had to do to come back from it. When Cassie stepped down from the stand, another voice stepped up to confirm what she had endured. This time, from someone who saw it firsthand. Dawn! Richard, a singer from Danity Kane and Diddy Dirty Money, was next to testify. She wasn't just a bystander in Diddy's orbit. She had worked directly under his label, seen the private dynamics of his circle, and watched what happened behind. The polished surface, her most striking memory? A morning in the kitchen. The group was at Diddy's house working on music. Cassie was cooking his breakfast. Something was off. Either the timing, the presentation, or maybe Diddy just woke up angry. Whatever it was, Dawn testified that he picked up the hot griddle and raised it like a weapon. She said he was about to strike Cassie in the head. Cassie dropped to the floor in a fetal position before the blow landed. According to Dawn, it wasn't the only time she saw Diddy act violently toward Cassie. But even more revealing was what didn't happen after. No one called the police. No one intervened. No one even spoke about it outside that house. And Dawn was honest about why. Fear, contracts, power. Everyone around Diddy either worked for him, owed him, or feared being shut out if they spoke up. Careers were at stake. And in an industry that rewards silence, staying quiet became the norm. This wasn't just about one abusive relationship. It was about a system of control that kept everyone around Diddy complicit. Even if they didn't realize it at the time, the defense, of course, challenged Dawn's motives. After all, she also has a pending civil lawsuit against Diddy for sexual and physical abuse. They suggested she was testifying for personal gain, that her memory might be shaped more by bitterness than truth. But her testimony added something Cassie's couldn't: independent verification. It showed that the abuse wasn't imagined. It wasn't just behind closed doors. Other people saw it and still did nothing. That silence, prosecutors argued, is part of how power protects itself. And in Diddy's world, silence had been currency for a long time. Until this point, much of the case had revolved around Cassie's story, her words, her experiences, her memories. But then Homeland Security entered the courtroom. Special Agent Yassine Bender took the stand. Calm, professional, and measured, Bender wasn't there to speculate. He was there to walk the jury through what happened the day Diddy was taken into custody, and more importantly, what they found. It was March 2024. Diddy was staying at the Park Hyatt in Manhattan, supposedly negotiating terms for a voluntary surrender. According to his lawyers, he was prepared to cooperate with federal authorities. But when agents entered his hotel room, what they discovered raised more questions than it answered. Inside the closet, multiple oversized bags of baby oil, bottles of Astroglide. In the bathroom, more baby oil. And on the counter, a prescription pill bottle filled with a pink powder, later identified as a mix of MDMA, cocaine, and possibly GHB, a drug often linked to sexual assault cases. The prescription was made out to Frank Black. That name had come up before. It was one of the aliases Diddy allegedly used to book hotel rooms for Freakoffs, a pattern Cassie had described in detail. But now, the name was on a controlled substance container found during an active investigation. The discovery of the pink drug mixture wasn't just disturbing, it was dangerous. Just weeks earlier, a model in Miami had been involved in a fatal car crash after reportedly using the same substance. It was a street blend with a reputation for knocking people out fast and hard. And here it was, in Diddy's room, while he was waiting to turn himself in. To prosecutors, the implications were chilling. Was he planning one last freak-off before surrendering? Was this an oversight or part of a larger pattern? Did this align with the stories Cassie and others had told of sex, control, and drugs wrapped in secrecy? The defense argued that nothing about the substances proved intent, that baby oil and lubricants aren't illegal, that the bottle with pink powder could have belonged to someone else, that the alias Frank Black wasn't necessarily Diddy's doing, but the timing and the context were hard to ignore. Here was a man under federal investigation, surrounded by items that mirrored years of allegations. It wasn't just suspicious, it was symbolic. And while Agent Bender didn't offer speculation, his testimony added weight to a narrative that was starting to feel undeniable, that Diddy's private life wasn't just chaotic, it was calculated. As the trial gained momentum, the courtroom started to sound less like a legal proceeding and more like a who's who of the entertainment industry. Big names were dropped, some directly, others only in passing. But their presence added another layer to an already messy story. Chris Brown, Nicki Minaj, Young Thug, Lauren London. Each name sparked whispers in the gallery and speculation across the internet. But the connections weren't always what people expected. Chris Brown came up first, not because he was involved in the case, but because of Diddy's jealousy. Cassie testified that Diddy once saw her dancing near Chris at a club and later accused her of cheating with him. She said there was nothing between them. No romance, no secret meetings. But that didn't stop Diddy from making it an issue. Nicki Minaj's name entered the mix for a different reason. Cassie had recorded a song with her, a track that to this day remains unreleased. According to Cassie, Diddy shelved the project. No reason was given. But prosecutors hinted that the move may have been about control, a pattern of limiting Cassie's independence and public exposure. Then came Young Thug and Lauren London. The connection was more indirect but just as intriguing. After Cassie and Diddy finally cut ties, she allegedly tried to reach him again, this time through intermediaries. Prosecutors revealed that Cassie may have asked Young Thug or Lauren London to pass along messages to Diddy. Not romantic messages, just contact. The defense pounced on this. If Cassie was finally free, if she had truly escaped an abusive, controlling relationship, why try to reconnect? Why go through other celebrities to reach him? Cassie didn't deny it, but she said that motivations weren't what they seemed, that trauma bonds don't disappear overnight, that after years of being wrapped up in someone else's world, it can take time and sometimes failed attempts to fully walk away. Still, the question lingered. Why Young Thug? Why Lauren London? Neither has been called to testify, at least. Not yet, but their mention created a ripple effect, a reminder that in Diddy's world, nothing was entirely private, and that Cassie's experience wasn't lived in a vacuum. She was surrounded by fame, by pressure, by people who might not have known the full story, or might have chosen not to. To the jury, these names may not mean much legally, but emotionally? They fill in the blanks. They show how far-reaching Diddy's influence was and how hard it might have been for Cassie to find a clean exit, because when someone controls the room, the contracts, the music, the money, even your friends might become part of the orbit. If the viral hotel hallway video was a spark, this might have been the fuel that kept the fire burning. Just before the trial began, word got out that Cassie had quietly settled a lawsuit with the Intercontinental Hotel chain, the very same brand where the infamous 2016 footage of Diddy assaulting her was captured. The settlement? $10 million. Most people didn't even know a lawsuit had been filed. But behind the scenes, it became clear. This hotel wasn't just a backdrop to their story. It was a recurring setting. According to Cassie, the Intercontinental, Century City had been used hundreds of times for Diddy's Freakoffs. It had become, in her words, one of their go-to places. That's where things get murky, because the hotel isn't just a building. It has staff, cameras, security, protocols, and if what Cassie claims is true, that these multi-day events were happening regularly, that escorts came and went, that drug use and abuse occurred, then the question becomes, how much did the hotel know? And how much did it ignore? From a legal standpoint, the Intercontinental may not have been criminally liable, but civil liability is different, especially when a brand's reputation is on the line. And with that video being associated with their property, their hallway, their cameras, their logo on every news clip, the risk wasn't just monetary, it was brand identity. That may explain why the hotel chose to settle. Quietly, quickly, without dragging it out in public court. Because a full trial would mean depositions, employee, testimonies, potential exposure of internal policies or lack thereof. The defense used the settlement to question Cassie's motives. They argued that she was chasing money, not justice, that she had consented for years and was now retroactively turning those experiences into payouts. First $20 million from Diddy, then $10 million from the hotel. What would be next? But the prosecution framed it differently. They pointed out that the hotel's willingness to pay without a fight might suggest they knew the risk of going to trial. That at minimum, there was a failure to protect the guests from repeated harm. And at worst, that they may have turned a blind eye to a pattern they didn't want to deal with. In the eyes of the public, it raised unsettling questions. What happens when powerful people use luxury spaces to hide bad behavior? And how many places, hotels, clubs, or studios have quietly watched it happen? Trials often come down to credibility, not just of the witnesses, but of the lawyers trying to make their case. And in this courtroom, the defense was starting to unravel. On paper, they had a strategy: challenge Cassie's memory, poke holes in her timeline, flood the court with texts and past behavior to paint her as unreliable. But in execution, things got messy, really messy. One night, the defense team submitted over 400 exhibits to the court. The time? 3 a.m. That might seem like aggressive lawyering, trying to stay ahead. But Judge Subramanian didn't see it that way. He was furious. He had set a clear deadline for submissions, 7:30 p.m. Anything after that disrupted the court's tight schedule. The prosecution objected. The judge agreed. From that point on, tension between the bench and the defense was hard to ignore. The defense also began introducing exhibits mid-examination, often without proper setup. A new photo, a text message, a video, but without context or pre-approval, those pieces were regularly struck down or met with objections that stopped the momentum cold. At one point, the judge even warned the defense against trying to run out the clock on Cassie, a subtle reference to her very visible pregnancy. Nearing 9 months, she was days, maybe hours, away from giving birth. And if her testimony couldn't be completed before labor, the prosecution risked a mistrial or severe delays. That raised suspicions. Was the defense intentionally dragging things out, hoping that by exhausting time, they could force the court into procedural chaos? Prosecutors weren't taking the chance. They accelerated their redirect, cleaned up Cassie's timeline, pushed to complete her testimony before the weekend. And they did. But the damage to the defense's image lingered. Legal analysts began pointing out their erratic pacing, their lack of cohesion, their apparent desperation to shift the narrative by volume rather than clarity. It wasn't just about what they were arguing. It was about how poorly they were doing it. In high-profile cases where public scrutiny matters almost as much as courtroom results, these moments aren't just mistakes. They're signals to the jury, to the media, to anyone paying attention, signals that the foundation might be cracking. And with more witnesses on the horizon, the prosecution was just getting started. As the trial pushed deeper into its second week, legal analysts began weighing in publicly. And the consensus was starting to take shape. This case, they said, isn't about proving every allegation. It doesn't have to be. Under federal law, for a sex trafficking conviction, prosecutors only need to prove one instance where a person was coerced into a commercial sex act through force, fraud, or manipulation. Just one. And according to multiple legal experts watching the trial, Cassie's testimony alone might meet that standard. They pointed to her detailed breakdown of the Freakoffs, how she was expected to participate, how escorts were hired, how drugs were involved, how Diddy profited from the control, and most critically, how she didn't feel free to say no. That psychological coercion, paired with a financial power imbalance and repeated sexual encounters, painted a picture that closely aligns with what the law defines as trafficking. The defense, of course, argued that Cassie was never sold or pimped out in the way those terms are usually imagined. They said she was a girlfriend, not a victim, that she had agency, that she stayed by choice, but prosecutors pushed back hard. They brought in experts on trauma bonding, on intimate partner coercion, on the difference between physical force and emotional captivity. And they reminded the jury, just because someone doesn't look like a victim doesn't mean they weren't treated like one. For the jury, it's a balancing act. On one hand, they're hearing about private moments, deeply personal, sometimes confusing, often contradictory. They're asked to judge not just what happened, but why it happened the way it did. They're filtering layers of emotion, ego, and memory. On the other hand, they're being told that even one credible moment of coercion, one provable abuse of power tied to a sexual act, could be enough for conviction. And it's not just Cassie anymore. At least 3 other women are expected to testify, each with their own stories. each potentially bringing more weight to a growing narrative that Diddy used his fame not just to attract women, but to control them, exploit them, silence them. One legal commentator put it this way: in cases like this, jurors don't need to believe everything. They just need to believe enough. And with each new testimony, that threshold is inching closer. Cassie may have stepped off the stand, but the echoes of her testimony are still bouncing around the courtroom and across the country. What happens next could reshape not just this case, but the entire conversation around fame, power, and accountability in the entertainment industry. First up, more witnesses. Dawn Richard will continue her testimony, offering more insight into what she saw, what she heard, and why she, like so many others, stayed silent for so long. Other women are scheduled to follow, each one adding new details, each one helping. Prosecutors build a pattern. There's also a growing list of civil cases still waiting in the wings. Some have been filed, others are rumored to be on the way. And while those won't directly impact the criminal trial, they'll keep the pressure on. In the media, in the industry, and behind the scenes, Diddy's team is scrambling, not just legally, but publicly. The damage to his brand is real. Sponsors have pulled out. Projects have gone dark. Collaborators are distancing themselves. And the more that comes out, the harder it becomes to spin this as a smear campaign or a misunderstanding. The judge has already expressed frustration with the defense's tactics. The prosecution is moving fast. And the jury? They're watching. Everything. Not just the testimony, but the behavior, the tone, the way each side carries itself when the cameras aren't rolling. But the real weight of this trial isn't just in the courtroom, it's in the questions it forces us to ask. How many times does someone have to say yes out of fear before it stops counting as consent? What does survival look like when your abuser is also your paycheck, your label, your partner? And how many people, managers, agents, hotel clerks, assistants, saw something and looked away? Cassie's story isn't clean. It's messy, conflicted, human. But that's exactly why it matters, because real abuse rarely fits into perfect sound bites. It's not always visible. It doesn't always end when the cameras start flashing. Sometimes it takes years, even decades, to name it, to explain it, to prove it. Now a jury has to decide what they believe. But whatever happens in that courtroom, one thing's already clear. This isn't just a trial about what Diddy did. It's a trial about what power allows people to get away with until it doesn't.